we could have alteration of the paintings. We don't want to take this risk.
Off the coast of Marseille, France, there's a cave that almost nobody on Earth has ever stood inside. Its entrance sits 37 meters underwater at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. To reach it, you have to swim through a flooded tunnel 175 meters long in total darkness with almost zero visibility. By every normal rule of archaeology, a site like this should have stayed lost forever. But in 1985, a diver chasing nothing more than curiosity followed a narrow crack in an underwater cliff face just to see where it went. What he eventually found wasn't just a cave. It was an art gallery older than the pyramids by more than 20,000 years, hidden behind a wall of seawater. However, what shocked researchers the most wasn't just the paintings. It was what those paintings showed. Animals that had no business being in a French cave, human hands missing their fingers, and one of the rarest images ever found in Ice Age art. So how did an art gallery end up at the bottom of the sea? And why did it take a tragedy to bring it into the light? Let's find out. The Underwater Cave, 1985. A man named Henri Cosquer was diving near Cap Morgiou, along the Calanques coastline outside Marseille. He already knew the area extremely well after years of exploring its underwater caves. At a depth of about 37 meters, roughly 121 feet below the surface, he noticed a dark cavity in the rock face. Most divers might have simply swum past it, but not Cosquer. Instead, he decided to follow the opening inward. That single decision led him into a narrow, flooded passage stretching about 175 meters through complete darkness. The passage slowly climbed upward as it went deeper into the rock. Cosquer didn't know it at the time, but that upward slope would eventually lead him somewhere no modern person had seen before. He kept returning to the passage over the following years, exploring it alone and pushing a little farther each time. He had no idea what might be waiting at the other end. But during one of those solo dives, his lamp malfunctioned. Suddenly, Cosquer was surrounded by pitch-black water. He had to turn around and find his way back without being able to see in the darkness. But even after that terrifying experience, Cosquer kept coming back to the same cave. By 1990, he finally realized that the passage had become too long and too dangerous to keep exploring by himself. So he brought in help. That year, he enlisted two Belgian cave divers, brothers Bernard and Mark van Espen, to help extend the guideline deeper into the passage. But reaching the end was not simply a matter of swimming farther. The floor was covered in fine silt, and disturbing it could turn the already dark water completely opaque. So the divers moved slowly and carefully. Eventually, they reached the end of the passage. And what they found left them shocked: an underground lake. However, above the water was a pocket of trapped air. That meant the flooded passage couldn't be the end of the cave. There had to be an open space beyond it, where the air was trapped. That is when those three ran into a huge problem, but they had run out of guidelines, leaving them no safe way to continue. So they were forced to turn back. But they weren't going to give up. Just a year later, they would return and finally reach the hidden space beyond the flooded passage. And what they discovered inside that part of the cave would force historians to rethink what they knew about human history. The hidden space. In June 1991, Mark van Espen returned to the cave. This time, he laid the final stretch of guideline needed to reach the dry section safely. The dive was relatively short, but it finally confirmed what Cosquer had suspected. There was a hidden dry chamber beyond the flooded passage, and humans could finally reach it. On July 9, 1991, Cosquer entered the cave with his niece, Sandrine, and a couple of other friends. Together, they pushed farther into the dry chambers than anyone had gone before. And then they saw it. Walls filled with paintings of horses, ibex, seals, and strange bird-like figures. Hand stencils and geometric symbols were carved directly into the rock. Entire walls were covered with this ancient artwork. The space had been sealed away from the outside world since the end of the last ice age. Yet inside, the markings looked like they had been made recently. Cosquer's first reaction wasn't excitement. It was disbelief. He later said that when he first saw the markings, he thought someone had come down into the cave and spray-painted graffiti on the walls. But as Cosquer and the others looked more closely, it became clear that these weren't modern markings. These were ancient paintings and engravings that had been sitting inside that chamber, untouched, for tens of thousands of years. Word of the discovery started to spread through the local diving community. And after hearing about the mysterious cave, 3 divers from Grenoble, a major city in southeastern France, decided to explore the same underwater passage on their own. But the passage was extremely difficult to navigate. It was dark, narrow, and filled with fine silt that could quickly destroy visibility. The 3 divers became lost inside the tunnel. They never made it back out. All 3 died before they could find their way to the surface. Cosquer and his friend Jan Goiran later took part in the grim task of recovering their bodies from the flooded passage. The tragedy made one thing clear. The cave was far too dangerous to remain a secret among divers. Keeping the discovery private was no longer an option. So, on September 3, 1991, Cosquer formally reported the cave to France's Maritime Affairs Department in Marseille. That report immediately triggered an official investigation. The discovery was passed to the Regional Archaeological Service under France's Ministry of Culture. And now, they were going to send a team of archaeologists to see the cave for themselves. The archaeological investigation. To confirm the paintings were real, someone had to examine them in person. But that meant finding an archaeologist who could reach the cave 37 meters underwater through a narrow, silt-filled tunnel. The problem was that almost nobody fit both requirements. Eventually, authorities turned to Jean Courtin. He was an expert in the Neolithic period, and one of the few qualified researchers who was physically capable of making the dangerous dive. On September 18, 1991, Courtin set out on the expedition aboard a research vessel called the Archaeonaut, along with renowned cave art specialist Jean Clot. Interestingly, Clotes wasn't a diver at the time. But after seeing photographs of the cave, he became so fascinated by the discovery that he eventually learned to scuba dive specifically to study the site himself. Over the next few days, the team carefully examined the cave and its paintings. And by September 20th, 1991, Courtin had authenticated the site. The paintings and engravings were genuine. They weren't a modern hoax staged inside a hard-to-reach underwater cave. But this created an even bigger question. If these were genuine Ice Age paintings, how had an ancient art gallery ended up at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea? France has more decorated Ice Age caves than any other country on Earth. But before the Cosquer discovery, every known example had been found west of the Rhône River. But this time, it was in Provence, east of the Rhône, where nothing like it had ever been found before. That unusual location alone was enough to make several prehistorians publicly question whether the paintings were genuine. Then, the details of the artwork reached the press, and the skepticism grew even louder. Critics pointed to what appeared to be a penguin-like bird, an animal nobody expected to see in French Ice Age art. They pointed to hand stencils that seemed to have missing fingers. And then there was something even stranger. The lower edges of several painted horses appeared to line up almost perfectly with the cave's current waterline. To some critics, these details seemed too unusual to be genuine. If the team wanted to prove that these were genuinely prehistoric paintings, they would need concrete evidence that could prove these were not modern fakes. The Ice Age paintings. When the first age estimates came out, some researchers were not convinced. The dates seemed simply too old to believe without stronger evidence. The problem was that proving these dates were accurate turned out to be really difficult. And to understand why it was so, you need to look at the method they use for this purpose: radiocarbon dating. It measures the amount of radioactive carbon left in a sample. Over time, that carbon slowly breaks down. The older the material is, the less radioactive carbon remains. The problem is that after tens of thousands of years, very little radioactive carbon is left, making the dates much harder to measure accurately. So researchers first turned to another clue: calcite. Calcite is a mineral that slowly forms over rock surfaces, building up layer by layer. A coating like this cannot form in just a few decades. If calcite had grown over a painting, then the painting had to be older than the mineral covering it. In 1998, researchers also recovered fragments of wood and pollen from the cave. These provided additional organic material that pointed toward the same general period. But the strongest evidence came from radiocarbon dating. Klotz and Cortin collected 27 separate radiocarbon dates from across the cave. The results formed two distinct groups. One centered around 27,000 years ago. The other was around 19,000 years ago. This showed that the cave wasn't decorated during a single visit. People had entered the cave, left, and then returned thousands of years later. And later research went even further. Between 1992 and 2012, scientists carried out around 60 radiocarbon tests on 41 different samples from the cave. These results further solidified the evidence that humans had visited the cave from roughly 27,000 to 19,000 years ago. The first group belonged to the Gravettian culture, which was active around 27,000 years ago, and most of the cave's hand stencils are associated with this period. Then, around 19,000 years ago, people returned during the Solutrian period, a culture known for more advanced stone tool technology, including blades attached to wooden handles. So, two different groups stood in the same chambers, thousands of years apart. But why did they keep returning to this particular cave? And why were they painting subjects so different from those found almost everywhere else in France? The strange animals. Most famous Ice Age caves in France, such as Lascaux and Chauvet, are filled with animals like horses, bison, and mammoths. But Cosquer is different. The cave contains horses, ibex, chamois, and the extinct giant deer called the megaloceros. But it also contains something rarely seen in Ice Age cave art: marine animals. There are dozens of images of seals, along with strange birds that look almost like penguins. But penguins have never lived in the Northern Hemisphere. So what were the artists actually drawing? Researchers believe the birds may be great auks. These were large, flightless seabirds that once lived around the North Atlantic. Their black and white bodies made them look surprisingly similar to penguins. The great auk eventually became extinct in the 1800s, meaning the cave may preserve some of the only surviving images of an animal that no longer exists. And the marine imagery doesn't stop there. Some markings represent jellyfish or octopuses, although their exact meaning is still uncertain. This unusual focus on sea life makes more sense when we remember that the cave was once close to the Ice Age coastline. For the people who lived there, These animals were part of the world around them. But the cave holds another major collection of artwork. Deep inside the dry chambers, the ceiling opens into a much larger space. Along one wall is the panel of horses, containing 63 horse figures. Nearby are crosses and other geometric marks carved directly into the rock. Nobody knows exactly what these symbols meant. And the artwork wasn't the only thing the cave preserved. Archaeologists also found charcoal from ancient fires and torches, along with some flint tools. They even found a 21.7-centimeter calcite plaque that may have been used as a lamp. So Cosquer didn't just preserve paintings, it also preserved traces of the people who made them, how they lived, moved through the darkness, and used the cave. But among all the strange artwork inside Cosquer, nothing is more mysterious than the hands left on its walls. The hands, with missing fingers. Among the oldest artwork inside the cave are dozens of these mysterious handprints. The artists made them by placing a hand against the rock and blowing pigment around it, leaving a clear outline behind. Official French records count 49 hand images, while other researchers have counted closer to 65. They were made using both red and black pigment, but the most interesting detail is what happened to the fingers. Of the 49 documented hands, 28 are missing at least one finger. That's about 57%. And there is a clear pattern. The thumbs are usually intact, while the other fingers appear to be missing. Researchers have found similar hand stencils at other Gravettian sites. At Gargas, in France, 114 of more than 230 recorded hand stencils are missing one or more fingers. At Maltravieso, in Spain, 61 of 71 show a similar pattern. So what happened? Nobody knows for sure. One theory is that the fingers were simply folded down while the artists made the stencils. Another suggests frostbite, since the pattern could match damage caused by extreme cold. A third theory is that the fingers may have formed an early sign language, with different positions carrying different meanings. However, so far, no explanation has been proven. And the hand stencils aren't the only unusual human images inside Cosquer. Across most Ice Age caves, artists mainly painted animals. Complete human figures were extremely rare. But Cosquer contains two unusual human-like images. One appears to combine the body of a seal with the upper body of a man. The other seems to show a human figure that has been struck by a spear or similar weapon. So what is this image supposed to mean? A hunting accident? A ritual? A warning? Or something connected to beliefs that disappeared thousands of years ago? We simply don't know. At this point, the deeper researchers looked into the cave, the stranger it became. And that raised an even bigger question. How did all of this ancient artwork end up at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea? What sealed the cave? To understand how this happened, we have to go back thousands of years. During the last ice age, global sea levels were as much as 100 to 120 meters lower than they are today. Huge amounts of water were locked away in glaciers and massive ice sheets. That meant the cave wasn't underwater at all. At the time, the cave was roughly 6 kilometers inland, near the edge of a cliff overlooking a wide, open landscape. There was no Mediterranean water anywhere near it. Then the climate began to change. Around 10,000 years ago, the warming period known as the Holocene began. Glaciers started melting rapidly, releasing huge amounts of water back into the oceans. And as the seas rose, the Mediterranean coastline slowly began moving inland. Year after year, century after century, the water pushed farther into the landscape. The valley in front of the cave was eventually swallowed completely, but the sea kept rising. Eventually, it reached the cave entrance itself. By roughly 9,000 years ago, the entrance had been submerged. The rising threat. Much of the artwork that once covered the lower walls of Cosquer is already gone. As sea levels rose after the last ice age, the lower parts of the cave flooded first. Over time, seawater dissolved and wore away much of the artwork on those lower walls. What remains today is mostly in the upper chambers, where the paintings stayed above the rising water for longer. But the danger didn't end after the cave was discovered in 1991. After 1994, research slowed for several years as the much easier-to-reach Chauvet Cave attracted more funding and attention. Studying Cosquer was expensive and dangerous because every visit required underwater diving. Then, in 2011, researchers Michel Olivet and Luc Van Rel documented worsening damage to several paintings. Rising sea levels, erosion, and changing currents were putting more pressure on the artwork. So protecting the cave became just as important as studying it. And that led to another secret. In March 1992, researchers discovered a second entrance into the cave system. Instead of making its location public, French authorities kept it secret to prevent unauthorized access. They kept that entrance secret for more than 30 years. Today, the real cave remains closed to the public. Only a small number of qualified researchers can enter, while scientists continue creating detailed 3D digital scans of the surviving sections. The goal is simple: preserve a record of the cave before more of it disappears. But the public still needed a way to experience this extraordinary place. So on June 4, 2022, a full-scale replica called Cosquer Méditerranée opened in Marseille. Visitors can experience a recreation of the underwater journey and see copies of the prehistoric artwork, including the 63 horses of the Panel of Horses. The original cave, however, remains sealed behind seawater. And after decades of research, some of its biggest mysteries still remain unanswered. So here's where that leaves us. A cave that had been hidden underwater for thousands of years was discovered almost by accident. And what it revealed was unlike anything scientists had ever seen before. So, after everything we've learned, what do you think? If a discovery this incredible could stay hidden for more than 20,000 years, what else could still be waiting in the darkness beneath the sea? Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more incredible discoveries, mysteries, and stories from the past. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.